Now, what's happened to me here is I've applied opacities and blending modes to my entire shapes here. But Illustrator gives me quite a bit more flexibility. I'm just going to pan down here a little bit, and I'll draw myself some new shapes. And what I'd like you to do as you're drawing yourself some new shapes is make sure that you have a stroke and a fill on all of your shapes. So just like before, give yourself at least 2 or 3 different shapes to work with here. And if you'd like to use different colors for your strokes and your fills, go ahead there. And the other thing, just to make sure that this will work well for us, is make sure that your strokes are nice and thick. So I'm just going to go and create my other shapes here. Make sure they're overlapping as well. That's kind of the idea here. Maybe I'll do something like this. Don't forget your keyboard shortcuts, by the way. As I'm working along here, I'm using X to flip between my fill and my stroke on my toolbox. And I'm holding down Control here while I still have my shape tool selected, and that grabs my black arrow tool. And I'll create one more quick shape here. Just something quick and simple. Doesn't have to be anything amazing. That's good enough. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my black arrow tool here. And now, like I say, rather than applying the opacity or blending mode to the entire object, I want to isolate my fills and my strokes apart from one another. And to do that, I have to employ my appearance palette. So go ahead and grab your appearance palette over on the right. Pull it over if you'd like. I'll bring it into my screen here. Now, we haven't really talked about appearance too much. We're going to go into much more detail with the appearance palette and live effects in an upcoming lesson. But for now, all you need to know is that the appearance palette tracks the different fills, strokes, effects, and so on that are applied to each of my objects. So if I select my green star in the back here, I can look inside the appearance palette and see that I have a yellow stroke, it's a 10-point stroke, and I have a green fill and a default transparency. So let me show you a couple of neat things here. First of all, I'll start with my rectangle on top here. I could highlight my rectangle, and then if I want to apply transparency or a blending mode to the entire object, I just have to make sure that path is highlighted at the top of the appearance palette. So I just clicked on it there. And then back up into my transparency palette, I can go and make some kind of an adjustment, and you can see that that opacity is being applied to both the fill and the stroke. I'm going to undo that. Control-C on the PC or Command-Z on the Mac. And instead what I'll do in my appearance palette is I will isolate my effect by highlighting either my fill or my stroke. So I'm going to highlight my fill, or I'm going to target my fill, if you will, and then go back to my transparency palette and apply a similar opacity effect here. And now you can see that the opacity is only applying to that fill. My stroke is retained. It's still 100%. How do I know? Well, I can look back inside my appearance palette. The appearance palette always tells all. I can see opacity 51%. That's what I used there. Back on the stroke, there's nothing applied to it. In fact, you can see this little twisty here, this little collapsy arrow here beside my fill there, so I can expand and collapse that if I like. I could then target my stroke and then go back up to my opacity and make some kind of an adjustment there. I'll pull that down to 75% there. Now I can see just a little bit of green coming through, just ever so much through my stroke there. I look back in my appearance palette and I can see the stroke color is red, my weight is 10 points, and there's my opacity, 75%. At any time I can go back to either my fill or my stroke, target it just by highlighting it in the appearance palette, go back to my transparency, there's my 51% for my fill, and maybe I'll knock that down to 25%. So I changed my opacity to 25%, and then down in my appearance palette, there's my color, and you can see that it's updated back in my artwork. So as you can see, you can achieve some pretty cool effects just by isolating your fills and your strokes in your appearance palette. Let's do a couple of other things here. Here's my second shape, and back in my appearance palette here, I will isolate my stroke, and maybe I'll put a 50% opacity on it. There it is, so I can begin to see my star coming through the stroke here. I can also see, by the way, the edge or the overlap, if you will, of the fill. And that's because, I'm just going to zoom out here a little bit, that's because the stroke in my appearance palette is on top of my fill. But check this out, sort of like layers, I can actually drag my stroke below my fill and achieve something like that. So now the fill's on top, the stroke's on the bottom. Let me do that one more time. I'll drag the stroke above the fill. I can see the stroke overlapping the fill there, because this is how strokes work in Illustrator. So if I have a 10-point stroke here, I have 5 points on one side of the path, 5 points on the other side of the path. So I can rearrange the stacking order of my fills and strokes inside the appearance palette. Now I could take my fill and go and apply maybe a 75% opacity, something like that. I'll just zoom out a little bit here so you can see the mess that is my Illustrator artwork here. And my fill is still isolated here in my appearance palette. I can see I have my opacity happening there. But the other thing that I can do is go up to my blending mode menu inside my transparency palette and go and choose a blending mode specifically for the fill. You can see there, opacity 75%, color dodge. The stroke is just opacity 50%. So I can target individual components of a vector object here. I'll do the same for my stroke here. I'll go up to my blending mode menu here and maybe I'll choose difference. And difference is only happening on my 10-point stroke. You can see that effect happening there. Difference is kind of a cool blend mode effect. And if you're new to all of these blending modes here, I totally encourage you to experiment and play around. And it won't take long for you to get a feel for all of the different effects that are possible with your blending modes. Okay, I'll zoom out just a little bit here. We've made a mess here, or at least I've made a mess. Yours probably looks much nicer than mine.